There is a phase that no one warns you about. Not your therapist. Not the books you have read about sensitivity. Not the people who call you gifted, or deeply feeling, or unusually aware. No one tells you that there exists a specific point in the life of an empath where everything that once defined them begins to collapse inward. Not dramatically, not with noise, but quietly. The way a structure gives way, not from a single blow, but from years of invisible pressure, accumulating in its walls until one day the foundation simply can no longer hold what was built upon it. Most empaths never name this phase because they do not understand what is happening when they are inside it. They only know that something has shifted in a way they cannot easily explain. The emotions that once moved through them freely now feel distant. The connections they once maintained with such care begin to feel hollow. The sensitivity they carried as both a burden and a form of identity starts to recede, and in its place arrives something unfamiliar, a strange quietude, a numbness at the edges of perception, a sense of watching their own life from a slight remove, as though the glass between them and the world has grown imperceptibly thicker. Here's the truth most people miss. This is not depression. It is not emotional breakdown. It is not the beginning of the end of their empathic nature. It is something far more precise and far more significant. It is the point at which the psyche of the empath reaches the absolute limit of what the original emotional architecture can sustain. And what happens at that limit determines everything. Whether the empath survives this phase intact, or whether they lose themselves entirely to one of two opposing forces, collapse or numbness, depends not on their willingness to feel, but on something they were almost certainly never taught. The capacity to let the old version of themselves dissolve without mistaking that dissolution for destruction. You must understand what this phase actually is, at its structural level, because if you have ever found yourself in it, or if you are in it now, what you are experiencing is not arbitrary. It follows a pattern, a hidden sequence that operates beneath the surface of conscious experience with the same precision as any other psychological law. I call this the detachment sequence, and it begins long before most empaths realize it has started. The detachment sequence does not announce itself. It initiates quietly, usually in the aftermath of one relationship or experience too many in which the empath extended themselves fully, only to find that the extension left them hollow. It may be a friendship that slowly revealed itself to be structured entirely around what the empath could provide. It may be a family dynamic that demanded emotional presence without ever offering it in return. It may be a series of encounters so subtle in their extraction that only in retrospect does the something essential was continuously being taken from them each time they gave. But regardless of the trigger, the internal response follows the same structural logic. The nervous system, conditioned across years or decades of overextension, reaches its threshold, and at that threshold it does something that feels, from the inside, like abandonment of the self. It withdraws the emotional signal. This is not something the empath chooses consciously. It is not a decision they make after careful reflection. It is an automatic recalibration, the psyche's equivalent of a circuit breaking under excessive current. The emotional channels that once transmitted feeling with such intensity and such immediacy begin to carry less. The empath may notice at first as a vague flatness in situations that would previously have moved them deeply. A conversation that would once have left them emotionally charged for hours now passes through them without leaving a mark. A sunset that once provoked something close to grief in its beauty now registers simply as light and atmosphere. The richness of the emotional world they inhabited has not disappeared, but access to it has become strangely difficult, as though the door that always stood open is now slightly closed, and they are not sure they remember how to open it from the inside. And once this happens, the second layer of the sequence begins. Because the empath does not only feel the withdrawal of sensation, they feel the loss of their identity through it. For an empath, the capacity to feel deeply is not merely a trait. It is the organizing principle around which the entire sense of self has been constructed. When that capacity begins to recede, even temporarily, the identity built upon it begins to destabilize. The questions that arise in this phase are not simple. They are not the ordinary questions of a person going through a difficult period. They carry an existential weight that is distinctive and often terrifying. Who am I without this feeling? If I can no longer sense others the way I once did, have I lost the thing that made me who I am? Is what I called empathy simply gone, or was it never truly mine to begin with? But what most people don't realize is that these questions, as painful as they are, represent the most important psychological threshold the empath will ever cross. Because embedded in them is the beginning of a distinction the psyche has never been forced to make before. The distinction between empathy as identity and empathy as capacity, between what you are and what you do, between the self and the function it has been performing for as long as it can remember. This distinction is not emotional, it is structural, and it is upon this structural distinction that the entire possibility of genuine, psychological survival rests. To understand why this distinction is so difficult for the empath to make, you must first understand what happened in the period before this phase arrived. Long before the detachment sequence began, there was a different sequence operating. One that was established early, one that shaped not only the empath's behavior but the architecture of their inner world at its most fundamental level. I call this the pattern recognition threshold, and it is the mechanism that created the empath's sensitivity in the first place. Not as a gift, as a response. The pattern recognition threshold develops in environments where emotional unpredictability is a consistent feature, where the moods of those around the child shift without warning, where safety depends not on stable conditions, but on the ability to read, in advance, the emotional state of the people who control the environment. In these conditions, the nervous system does something remarkable. It begins to specialize. It develops an extraordinary sensitivity to subtle cues, the slight change in tone before an argument, the particular quality of silence that precedes withdrawal, the micro-expression that signals that something has shifted in the relational atmosphere long before any explicit sign has been given. This specialization is adaptive. It serves a real function. It keeps the child oriented within an environment that would otherwise feel dangerously chaotic. But here is what this developmental process produces in the long run. It produces an individual whose nervous system is calibrated to constant environmental scanning as its default state, not as a skill that can be applied selectively, as an automatic background process that runs continuously, consuming energy that other systems might otherwise have access to. The empath does not choose to sense everything around them. They cannot choose not to. The pattern recognition threshold has been set so low, calibrated across so many early experiences, that even neutral environments register as charged. Even silence carries emotional information that the empath's system processes and responds to without conscious involvement. This is where everything changes in terms of understanding the empath's relational life. Because a person who is constitutionally unable to stop reading the emotional environment they inhabit is a person who cannot be truly present in any relationship without also continuously performing an unconscious labor that no one else in the relationship is aware is taking place. Every conversation carries within it two simultaneous events for the empath: the surface exchange of words and meaning, and beneath it the constant silent processing of emotional subtext, of unspoken tensions, of the distance between what is being said and what is actually felt by the other person. This dual experience is exhausting in a way that is almost impossible to communicate to someone who has not lived it. And because it is invisible, because it produces no visible sign of effort, the people in the empath's life rarely account for it. They only notice that the empath sometimes withdraws without explanation, that they sometimes seem suddenly depleted in the middle of an experience that appeared to everyone else entirely ordinary. Over time, this pattern produces something else. Because the empath's capacity for sensing others is continuously directed outward, their relationship with their own inner experience becomes, paradoxically, less developed than one might expect. They are extraordinarily attuned to the emotional states of others, but they have often had little practice attending to the quiet signals of their own needs, their own desires, their own limits. The inner voice that might say this is too much, or I need to stop, or this situation is harming me, has been systematically overlooked in favor of the more urgent and more practiced task of reading the external emotional field. This is the hidden condition that the empath brings into adulthood, a profound perceptive capacity directed almost entirely outward, an underdeveloped relationship with the interior landscape of their own experience, and a relational identity built on the unconscious assumption that their value lies in what they can perceive, absorb, and stabilize in others. And once this condition is understood, the logic of the detachment sequence becomes clear. Because what the sequence is actually doing, beneath the apparent flatness and the apparent loss of connection, is something that the empath system has never been permitted to do before. It is turning the signal inward. The emotional sensitivity that spent decades scanning external environments is being redirected, involuntarily at first, chaotically and without conscious intention, but inward nonetheless. And this redirection, though it feels like loss, though it feels like a diminishment of everything that once made the empath who they were, is in fact the beginning of something that most empaths will spend their entire lives without ever reaching. It is the beginning of the encounter with themselves. The encounter with the self is not, for the empath, a gentle or particularly welcoming experience, because what the inward turn reveals is not simply the quiet interior of a person who has been overlooking their own needs. What it reveals is the full weight of everything that has been accumulated and left unprocessed across years of continuous external attunement. The grief that was never allowed its time because someone else's crisis always arrived first. The anger that was suppressed because the empath's identity depended on remaining compassionate and accessible. The longing for reciprocity that was quietly buried beneath the assumption that others simply did not have the capacity to offer what the empath could perceive they needed. All of this begins to surface, not in an orderly fashion, not in a way that the empath can easily integrate or make sense of, but with the accumulated force of material that has been held under pressure for a very long time. This is the stage at which the empath faces a choice, though it rarely feels like one. They can attempt to suppress this emerging interior material, pushing it back down with the same mechanisms of self-control and outward focus that managed it for years. Or they can allow it to surface, accepting the disruption and the disorientation that this surfacing will inevitably produce. But what most people don't realize is that these two paths lead to vastly different outcomes. The path of suppression produces the empath who gradually becomes emotionally unavailable, not by choice, but by depletion. Who loses not only the excessive sensitivity that once overwhelmed them, but eventually the capacity for genuine emotional engagement altogether. Who arrives at a kind of functional deadness that others may interpret as maturity or composure, but which internally registers as a permanent gray absence where richness once existed. The path of allowing, by contrast, leads somewhere that very few empaths in this phase can see from where they are standing. It leads toward what the identity shift principle actually means when applied to a person whose entire sense of self has been organized around their relation to others. It means the construction, often for the first time, of a self that exists not in response to the emotional world around it, but at the center of its own experience. A self that can feel without that feeling constituting its entire reason for existing. A self that can perceive others without that perception representing the totality of its psychological function. This identity shift is not accomplished quickly. It does not arrive as an insight. It is not produced by understanding alone. It requires something that the empath, precisely because of the architecture their early life created, finds extraordinarily difficult to sustain. It requires turning consistently toward one's own interior experience, even when that experience is uncomfortable, even when it contradicts the persona that has been carefully maintained, even when the act of attending to oneself feels like a betrayal of the relational identity that provided the only stable sense of worth the empath has ever known. There comes a point in this process that feels, from the inside, like standing at the edge of a territory with no map. The empath has passed through the initial flatness of the detachment sequence. They have begun, however reluctantly, to encounter the interior material that the inward turn has surfaced. They have started to sense, however dimly, that the identity they carried was constructed around a function rather than rooted in a self. And from this recognition, something begins to shift in their perception of their own history. Not suddenly, not with the clarity of a revelation, but with the slow and often painful accumulation of a new way of understanding what their life has actually been. This is the stage I would call the power reversal logic, though the word power here requires careful definition. It does not refer to dominance. It does not refer to the capacity to control others or to achieve outcomes in the external world. The power that begins to shift in this phase is far more interior. It is the psyche's relationship to its own experience. The question of whether the empath is governed by the emotional field around them, or whether they have developed, at last, a stable enough interior structure to stand within that field, without being entirely shaped by it. For most of the empath's life, the emotional field has held the governing position. Their moods, their sense of safety, their experience of meaning, their very sense of who they are, all of these have been continuously responsive to what was happening around them. Not because they were weak, but because the pattern recognition threshold ensured that the environment was always registered before the interior was consulted. The signal always ran in that direction, from outside inward, from the perceived emotional state of others toward the empath's own corresponding response. The power reversal that occurs in this phase is the slow, difficult reorientation of that signal. It is the psyche learning, against the grain of its entire conditioning, to move from inside outward instead. To begin with its own interior state as the reference point, rather than the emotional condition of the surrounding environment. To ask not, what does this person need, or what does this situation require of me, but what am I actually experiencing? What do I actually need? What does my own interior signal say about what belongs here? This reorientation is not selfish, though the empath will almost certainly feel, at various points in its development, that it must be, because the relational identity that defined them was built on the premise that their needs came second, that their primary purpose was receptive and stabilizing, that to place their own interior experience at the center was somehow a violation of the thing that made them valuable. These feelings are not signs that the reorientation is wrong. They are the last pressure of an old structure resisting its own necessary dissolution. And once this happens, once the empath begins to genuinely inhabit the power reversal, something extraordinary and irreversible occurs. The emotional sensitivity that once made them chronically vulnerable to external conditions does not disappear, but it is no longer a source of involuntary exposure. It becomes, for the first time, something closer to an instrument, a capacity that can be directed, applied consciously, withdrawn when withdrawal is appropriate, extended when genuine connection warrants it. The empath still feels, they still perceive, they still register the emotional undercurrents of the world around them with a precision that most people will never develop. But they are no longer at the mercy of what they perceive. They have become, in the most fundamental sense, the one who decides what to do with what they see. This transformation carries a particular quality of solitude, and it is important to understand why. Because as the empath's interior center strengthens, as the power reversal becomes more stable, many of the relational dynamics that previously held them in place begin to shift. People who were unconsciously drawn to the empath's availability find that the availability has changed, not vanished, but altered. There is now a quality of discernment in the empath's engagement that was not previously present. A selectivity that communicates without words, that not every emotional demand will be met with. The same automatic responsiveness that once characterized every interaction. Some will experience this shift as rejection. Some will push back. Some will name the change with accusations designed to reactivate the old guilt. You have become cold. You are not the same person. Something is wrong with you. You used to understand me. These reactions are not evidence that the transformation is a mistake. They are evidence that the transformation is real, because the people who benefited most from the empath's former condition, are precisely the people most likely to resist its dissolution. The solitude that accompanies this phase is not the solitude of exclusion. It is not the loneliness of someone who cannot connect. It is something more precise and in its own way, more demanding. It is the solitude of someone who has moved into a different psychological register than most of the people around them, who perceives the unconscious dynamics of social interaction with a clarity that makes unreflective engagement feel hollow, who can no longer participate in the usual agreements to remain on the surface, to avoid what is actually present, to perform connection without genuinely inhabiting it. This is the loneliness of clarity, and it is, paradoxically, the clearest sign that the transformation has genuinely taken hold. Because what the fully individuated empath eventually discovers is that the sensitivity they spent so long either suffering beneath or defending against has not been diminished by this process. It has been grounded. The difference between the empath at the beginning of this journey and the empath at its end is not the presence or absence of perceptive depth. It is the presence or absence of an interior foundation stable enough to hold that depth without being overwhelmed by it. The earlier empath was all perception and no ground. The later empath has both. And from that position, the empathy that was once a survival mechanism, once an involuntary exposure, once a source of chronic depletion, becomes something else entirely. It becomes presence, not the presence of someone who is available to absorb whatever arrives, but the presence of someone who is genuinely, stably here, who can witness another person's experience without needing to rescue them from it, who can feel the emotional truth of a situation without constructing their identity around their response to it, who can engage with the full complexity of human experience, its grief, its confusion, its contradiction, its darkness, from a center that remains, through all of it, intact. This is what the 1% actually means. Not that only 1% of empaths possess the capacity for this transformation, but that only 1% persist through the full disorientation of its process, without turning back, without retreating into numbness before the interior work is complete, without collapsing under the weight of the old identities, dissolution before the new center has had time to form. The path is not closed to anyone, but it requires enduring a particular kind of uncertainty that most people, when they encounter it, choose to exit by whatever door appears first. Those who do not exit emerge into something that cannot be taken from them. Not a permanent state of equanimity, not an immunity to pain or confusion or the ordinary difficulties of being human, but a stable relationship with themselves that no external condition can entirely destabilize. A center that exists independent of whether others see them, need them, validate them, or understand them. An empathy that is no longer compulsive, that is no longer a wound dressed as a gift, that is, finally and without apology, their own.